Tonight, we're diving into the life and legacy of the legendary Queen Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra was a brilliant, fearless, and iconic figure who ruled with unmatched intelligence and charm, navigating the deadly politics of her time and leaving a mark on history that still fascinates the world today. So, before you settle in and get cozy, take a second, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments where and when you're watching from. Now let's get into this incredible story of power, love, and legacy. We hope it helps you learn while you sleep. The sun rose over the Nile with a golden hush, painting the water in warm hues of amber and crimson. In the great city of Alexandria, a place where Greek architecture met the heartbeat of ancient Egypt, a child was born into power, beauty, and peril. Her name would echo through history, Cleopatra VII Philopator. Cleopatra was not the first of her name, nor the first ruler of Egypt to be draped in royalty and intrigue. She belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Macedonian Greeks who had ruled Egypt since the days of Alexander the Great. For nearly 3 centuries, her ancestors held the throne, not as Egyptians, but as foreign monarchs ruling a proud and ancient land. Yet Cleopatra would be different. She would become the last pharaoh of Egypt, and the only one to truly claim the hearts of both her people and her enemies. Born around 69 BC, Cleopatra was the daughter of Ptolemy XII Auletes, a weak and unpopular king whose reign was plagued by debts and Roman interference. Her early years were marked by luxury, certainly, but also by uncertainty. The Ptolemies were infamous for their ruthless ambition. Brothers and sisters often turned on each other. Assassinations were not rare. Trust was fragile. And young Cleopatra, even as a girl, understood the stakes. From the very beginning, she stood out. Unlike her siblings, Cleopatra made a deliberate effort to speak the native Egyptian language, an act that no Ptolemaic ruler before her had done. She mastered not only Greek and Egyptian, but also Latin, Hebrew, and several other tongues. Her intellect was formidable. She read philosophy, studied astronomy, and surrounded herself with scholars in the great library of Alexandria. To those who knew her, she was more than a princess. She was a force of nature, destined to rule, yet burdened by the weight of a fractured empire. Her father's reign teetered constantly on collapse. Roman power loomed larger each year, creeping into Egyptian politics like a slow, inevitable tide. When Cleopatra was just a teenager, her father was forced into exile, driven from his throne by internal rebellion. For a brief time, the palace was no place of safety. It was a cage of daggers. Cleopatra watched as the court turned in on itself, as alliances shifted overnight, as blood stained marble. Yet her father returned, with the help of Roman gold and military force. Cleopatra learned then that survival was not about strength alone. It was about influence. It was about charm. It was about knowing when to bend and when to strike. As she grew into a young woman, the world around her grew more dangerous. Egypt was still a land of riches, grain, gold, papyrus, but its independence was fragile. Rome was hungry. The Senate watched Egypt closely, eyeing its ports, its treasury, its legendary Nile. Cleopatra knew that the crown she was born into was both a blessing and a trap. But she was ready, and the world was not. Cleopatra was just 18 years old when her father, Ptolemy XII, died in 51 BC. By his will, Cleopatra was to rule Egypt alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only 10. The Ptolemaic tradition required sibling marriage for joint rule, and so Cleopatra became both sister and queen to the boy king. But co-rulership was never equal. From the start, Cleopatra took the reins of power. She issued decrees in her name alone, appeared without her brother in state documents, and conducted foreign policy with bold independence. Her image on coinage stood alone, unusual, and telling. The people saw her not as a consort, but as pharaoh. This did not sit well with the royal court. Behind young Ptolemy stood a faction of ambitious courtiers and advisors, men who saw Cleopatra's strength as a threat. They whispered into the ears of the boy king, twisting his view of his sister. They portrayed her assertiveness as arrogance, her intelligence as manipulation. Slowly, they poisoned the trust between the siblings, setting the stage for a bitter civil war. By 49 BC, Cleopatra had been forced to flee Alexandria. She took refuge in the eastern deserts, gathering loyal forces and planning her return. Her face may have been absent from the palace, but her presence still lingered in the minds of the people. She had charisma, wit, and an unshakable belief in her right to rule. And then, as if guided by fate, the Roman world came crashing into hers. Across the Mediterranean, Rome was in turmoil. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, once allies, now enemies, were locked in a brutal civil war. In 48 BC, after his defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge and support from the young Ptolemy XIII. But Egypt had learned to read the winds of Roman politics. In a move designed to impress Caesar, the advisors of Ptolemy murdered Pompey upon his arrival, presenting his severed head to Caesar when he followed days later. It was a miscalculation. Caesar, though no friend to Pompey, was disgusted by the act. He saw in it not loyalty, but cowardice and savagery, and he demanded stability in Egypt. It was at this moment that Cleopatra made her move. Knowing the stakes, she devised a plan as daring as it was theatrical. With the city under her brother's control and the palace guarded, she could not enter openly. So she had herself rolled up in a rug, some say a sack of linens, and smuggled into Caesar's chambers by a loyal servant. When Caesar unwrapped the bundle, he found Cleopatra herself, radiant and unafraid, standing before him. She didn't need to beg. She didn't need to plead. She spoke with confidence, intelligence, and wit. And she captured Caesar's attention instantly. The tides of power had shifted again. But this time, they turned in her favor. Julius Caesar was not a man easily swayed. He had conquered Gaul, defied the Roman Senate, and crossed the Rubicon with a legion at his back. But Cleopatra was unlike anyone he had ever met. She wasn't just beautiful, though many spoke of her striking presence. She was brilliant. She spoke to Caesar not as a supplicant, but as an equal. She discussed politics, philosophy, and strategy with a sharp tongue and a knowing smile. Caesar found in her what few had offered him before, a partner in intellect and ambition. Within days of their first meeting, Cleopatra had secured his support. He declared her co-ruler of Egypt, alongside a younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, whom she married in name only. Ptolemy XIII, the brother who had betrayed her, refused to accept this new order. Civil war broke out in the streets of Alexandria. For months, the city was engulfed in violence, flames and blood staining the marble courtyards of the palace. Caesar fought alongside Cleopatra. His legions battled Egyptian forces, many of whom were funded by Cleopatra's rivals. In the chaos, the great library of Alexandria suffered a devastating fire. It's said that scrolls containing centuries of knowledge vanished in smoke, though how much was lost remains debated even today. Eventually, Caesar's forces triumphed. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile during a failed escape. Cleopatra, at just 21 years old, had secured her throne again, this time more firmly than before. But she wanted more than a crown. In the months that followed, Cleopatra and Caesar lived as lovers and rulers. She bore him a son, Ptolemy 15, whom she named Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. Though Caesar never officially acknowledged the child as his heir, Cleopatra was certain of his paternity. She saw in Caesarion the future of a united empire, Egyptian and Roman, east and west. To solidify her position, Cleopatra sailed to Rome in 46 BC. Her arrival was a sensation. She did not dress as a foreign dignitary, but as the goddess Isis incarnate. Wrapped in fine silks and adorned in gold, she brought with her an entourage of dancers, priests, and scholars. Romans were scandalized, fascinated, and unnerved. Here was a queen who walked like a deity and spoke with the confidence of a general. In Rome, she stayed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber. Her presence stirred whispers. She was the foreign queen, the lover of the dictator, the mother of his son. Many Roman senators saw her as a threat, a symbol of Caesar's growing ambition, and his dangerous affection for monarchy. Yet Cleopatra played her role masterfully. She attended banquets. She observed Roman customs. And she watched, always calculating, always listening. But beneath the glamour and celebration, a storm was brewing. Many feared that Caesar's growing power would destroy the Republic. And in Cleopatra, they saw a mirror of that threat, royalty reborn, not in Rome, but in the East. In 44 BC, the knives came out, and everything changed. The Ides of March arrived with a chill in the Roman air. On the 15th day of that fateful month in 44 BC, Julius Caesar, dictator for life, master of the Roman world, was stabbed 23 times on the floor of the theater of Pompey. The conspirators, many of whom had once called him friend, believed they were saving the Republic from tyranny. But what they unleashed was chaos. Cleopatra, still in Rome with her young son Caesarion, received the news not with tears, but with silence. She had seen betrayal before. She had survived it before. But this was different. Caesar had been more than an ally. He had been her shield. Her path to power had run alongside his. Now, with his death, her future in Rome vanished overnight. The city turned cold toward her. Without Caesar's protection, Cleopatra was no longer a guest. She was a foreign queen, the mother of a child whom some whispered could be a rival to Rome's next ruler. She understood the danger, and she acted quickly. She returned to Egypt with Caesarion, sailing down the Nile once more, her heart heavy but her resolve untouched. The palace in Alexandria welcomed her return, but the world had changed. Caesar's assassination had plunged Rome into civil war again. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, hunting down Caesar's killers and fighting for control of the empire he left behind. Cleopatra watched from afar, listening to every rumor that reached her court, analyzing each shift in Roman power. She ruled Egypt as queen and mother now, determined to protect her throne and her son. Egypt, still rich in grain and gold, remained vital to Rome's economy. Cleopatra knew that if she played her cards right, she could become indispensable. In the years that followed, she strengthened Egypt's defenses, built alliances, and kept Rome close, but always at a distance. Her court became a center of learning and luxury again. Philosophers, mathematicians, and poets flocked to Alexandria. Cleopatra ruled not only with strategy but with spectacle. She elevated her image as the living goddess Isis, divine mother of Caesarion, queen of Egypt and protector of the old ways. But she also understood that her fate was still bound to Rome. And Rome, as always, came knocking. In 41 BCE, Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most trusted generals and now ruler of the eastern Roman provinces, summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus. He needed her support, resources, ships, and grain for his coming campaign against the Parthians. Cleopatra could have sent envoys. She could have written letters. But she chose instead to stage an entrance that would become legend. Sailing up the Cydnus River on a gilded barge, she arrived not as a queen, but as a goddess. Dressed as Aphrodite, reclining beneath a canopy of purple sails, Cleopatra dazzled the city. Her arrival was not a visit. It was a performance. And Mark Antony? He was the audience. When Cleopatra met Mark Antony in Tarsus, she wasn't meeting just a Roman general. She was meeting a man who had fought beside Caesar, who now ruled half of Rome's territories, and who, like her, was a creature of ambition. Their meeting was more than politics. It was theater, chemistry, and calculation all at once. Cleopatra's arrival had been meticulously planned. Her barge shimmered with gold. Musicians played exotic melodies. Incense perfumed the air. Cleopatra herself, dressed as the goddess of love, lay beneath a silk canopy, surrounded by servants fanning her with peacock feathers. The message was clear. She wasn't merely a queen, she was divine. Antony was enthralled. But Cleopatra was not there simply to enchant. She needed assurance. Rome had not been kind to Egypt in recent years. She wanted protection for her kingdom and legitimacy for her son, Caesar. Antony, in turn, needed supplies, wealth, and ships for his campaign. Their alliance was sealed over feasts and long conversations that lasted deep into the night. What began as a political maneuver blossomed into a love affair. Cleopatra invited Antony to Alexandria. There, away from the harsh gaze of Roman politics, their relationship deepened. The two became inseparable, indulging in the city's luxuries, hosting elaborate parties, and forming what they called the Inimitable Livers, a private society devoted to revelry and pleasure. Yet beneath the laughter and wine, the politics never stopped. Cleopatra bore Antony twins, a boy and a girl, and later another son. Their union was not only passionate, but powerful. Together they envisioned a new empire, not ruled from Rome, but from Alexandria. One where East and West would be joined under their reign, with Caesar as heir. But back in Rome, whispers grew louder. Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son, viewed Antony's alliance with Cleopatra as betrayal. He painted the queen as a foreign seductress who had corrupted a Roman hero. He claimed Antony had turned his back on Roman values, and that Cleopatra sought to steal the empire itself. Antony's behavior didn't help. He gave Cleopatra vast territories once controlled by Rome. He named Caesar King of Kings, and declared him the rightful heir of Caesar. To the Roman Senate, it was unthinkable. To Octavian, it was war. The rift between Antony and Octavian became a chasm. The Roman world began to split in two. Cleopatra, ever watchful, prepared for the storm ahead. She had been underestimated before. She had been exiled, betrayed, and forced to rebuild from ruin. But this time, she wasn't alone. She had Antony. She had Caesar. She had Egypt's wealth and its people. And she believed in the destiny she and Antony were shaping together. A new order, one where Rome would not conquer Egypt, but be transformed by it. The battle lines were being drawn. The final chapter of Cleopatra's life, the most dramatic of all, was about to begin. By 32 BC, Rome was no longer simply uneasy with Cleopatra. It was enraged. Octavian, now the most powerful man in the Western Roman world, had declared war. But not on Mark Antony directly. No, his declaration was made against Cleopatra herself. It was a clever move. Roman citizens might have balked at a civil war, Roman against Roman. But a war against a foreign queen, that could be framed as a crusade for Rome's honor. Cleopatra understood the stakes. She knew this war wasn't just about borders or pride. It was about survival. For herself. For her children. For Egypt. She and Antony began to prepare. They gathered fleets, recruited soldiers, and fortified their strongholds. But tensions ran high. Their forces were spread across the eastern Mediterranean. Supplies were stretched. And in Rome, Octavian's propaganda worked. He distributed Antony's will, stolen from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins, claiming Antony planned to make Alexandria the new capital of the empire and pass power to Cleopatra and her children. Romans were furious. Antony, once beloved, was now seen as a traitor. Cleopatra, a sorceress. A manipulative queen who had bewitched their general and poisoned Roman honor. The image Octavian painted was powerful and dangerous. The decisive clash came at sea. In 31 BC, the forces of Antony and Cleopatra met Octavian's fleet near the Greek coast, in a bay known as Actium. Cleopatra brought 60 Egyptian warships, and Antony commanded a formidable fleet. But Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, was a brilliant strategist. He blockaded their supply lines, outmaneuvered their ships, and slowly strangled their position. Then, during the heat of battle, Cleopatra made a fateful decision. With her ships under siege, she ordered a retreat. Some say she believed the battle was lost. Others claim her ships were never fully committed, held back in reserve, and she refused to risk them. Either way, when her sails turned and she fled the battlefield, Antony followed, abandoning the fight to pursue her. His men, left leaderless, surrendered or were destroyed. The Battle of Actium was a disaster. Cleopatra and Antony retreated to Egypt, their armies broken, their resources depleted, and their reputations shattered. In Alexandria, they tried to rebuild. They raised what troops they could. They fortified the city. But deep down, they both knew the end was coming. Octavian would not stop. He would pursue them across the sea, across the sand, into the heart of Egypt if he had to. He would not rest until both Cleopatra and Antony were dead and their children erased from history. Still, Cleopatra refused to go quietly. She knew how to fight in the shadows, how to weave influence from behind palace walls. She began secret negotiations with Octavian, trying to preserve her throne, or at the very least, the life of her son Caesarion. She had lost battles before, but she had never lost a war. Not yet. In the final days of their reign, Alexandria felt like a city under a dark cloud. Its streets were quiet, its markets thin, and even the endless blue of the Nile seemed subdued. Cleopatra walked the marble halls of her palace with calm dignity, but her heart was in turmoil. Outside the walls, Octavian's forces closed in. Inside, the future unraveled. Mark Antony, once a fearless warrior, now wandered the palace like a man lost. His pride had been wounded at Actium, and his name, once spoken with admiration, was now mocked across Rome. Still, he tried to hold on to hope. He trained troops. He made speeches. But it was clear, the tide had turned, and it would not rise again in his favor. Cleopatra never stopped planning. While Antony focused on preparing for a final defense, she reached out in secret to Octavian. She sent envoys offering peace, offering riches, even offering to abdicate in favor of her eldest son, Caesarion. She promised to hand over Antony if her son could rule in peace. But Octavian was cold, unmoved. He wanted only one thing: total victory. Still, Cleopatra had one weapon left: her ability to control the story. She began to stage her legacy. Within the palace walls, she held elaborate ceremonies. She dressed again as the goddess Isis, appearing before her people as if she were immortal and untouchable. She hosted Antony in grand banquets, where they toasted to life, to love, and to eternity even as doom crept closer. They say that Cleopatra had a mausoleum constructed beside the palace. A towering monument of stone and gold, it was said to be filled with her treasures, jewels, scrolls, relics of Egyptian gods. But it was more than a tomb. It was a message. A warning. If she could not live as queen, she would die as one, and Egypt's wealth would die with her. In late July of 30 BC, Octavian arrived in Egypt. His legions swept through the countryside with little resistance. Antony led a final, desperate charge outside Alexandria, but it failed. Wounded and broken, he returned to the city only to hear a devastating rumor: Cleopatra had taken her own life. Grief-stricken and believing all was lost, Antony fell on his own sword. But the rumor was false. Cleopatra was still alive. Mortally wounded, Antony was carried to her by loyal servants. In a heartbreaking moment, he died in her arms. The man she had loved and fought beside for over a decade, gone. The next day, Octavian entered Alexandria. He did not storm the palace. There was no bloodbath. Just silence. He found Cleopatra in mourning, dressed in simple robes, her crown abandoned. But she was not finished yet. She requested an audience with him. One final meeting. One final negotiation. Cleopatra still had her pride. She still had her purpose. And she would not allow Rome to write the ending of her story. Not without a fight. Cleopatra met Octavian face to face in her palace. A room once filled with music and laughter, now echoing with quiet dread. She stood tall, regal despite her grief, her eyes steady as she looked into the face of Rome's future emperor. Octavian was young, calm, calculating. He had already won the war. But Cleopatra wanted to win something else: dignity, legacy, perhaps even mercy for her children. Their meeting was tense but controlled. Cleopatra spoke as a sovereign. She offered herself, her treasure, even Egypt itself, if her children could live. She made no pleas for her own life. She did not weep. Octavian, ever the tactician, listened carefully. He had already decided not to kill her immediately. He wanted to parade her through Rome, chained and broken, as part of his triumph, proof that he had conquered the East. But Cleopatra had no intention of being anyone's trophy. After the meeting, she was placed under watch in her mausoleum, her final sanctuary, the stone monument she had built as both tomb and fortress. Octavian confiscated her treasure, disarmed her guards, and sent orders to capture Caesar Ion if he tried to flee south. Cleopatra waited. She knew the game was nearly over. Her kingdom was lost. Her lover was dead. Rome had won. But she would not give Octavian the satisfaction of parading her through his streets. Days later, on a hot August afternoon in 30 BC, Cleopatra prepared for her final act. Dressed in her royal garments, she adorned herself in jewels, symbols not of vanity, but of identity. She was not leaving the world as a prisoner. She was leaving it as a queen. How Cleopatra died remains a mystery lost to time. Ancient sources say she ordered a basket of figs to be delivered to her chambers, concealing inside a venomous asp, Egypt's sacred cobra. Others suggest a poison needle hidden in a comb, or a vial of fast-acting toxin she had smuggled past Roman guards. What is known is this: Cleopatra was found lying on a golden couch, serene, with two of her most loyal handmaidens beside her, also dead. There were no signs of struggle, no fear in her eyes, only peace. Octavian was furious. He had been denied his prize. The woman he had wanted to display as a symbol of his conquest had slipped through his fingers. Her body was treated with unexpected care. He allowed her to be buried beside Antony, as she had wished. And so ended the life of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and the last true monarch to sit on the throne of the Nile. With her death, over 3,000 years of Egyptian independence came to a close. But her story did not die. It began. Cleopatra's death marked more than the end of a life. It marked the end of an era. Egypt, once the cradle of ancient civilization, was now a Roman province. No more pharaohs. No more divine queens. The Nile flowed as it always had, but its throne sat empty, absorbed into the ever-expanding grip of the Roman Empire. Octavian returned to Rome a conqueror. He was hailed as a hero, a restorer of order, and soon would take the title Augustus, becoming the first Roman emperor. His rise was built not only on military triumph but on the ashes of Cleopatra's reign. Her defeat helped seal his legend. But even as Rome celebrated, Cleopatra remained in the minds of those who had known her, feared her, or loved her. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar and the boy she had hoped would one day unite East and West, was captured and executed on Octavian's orders. "Too many Caesars is not a good thing," he reportedly said. The other children she had with Mark Antony were taken to Rome and raised by Antony's widow, Octavia, sister to Octavian, a strange twist of fate, but perhaps a small mercy. And yet, Cleopatra could not be erased. For centuries to come, writers, poets, and historians would try to capture her essence. Some painted her as a dangerous temptress who seduced powerful men and destroyed empires. Others saw her as a brilliant strategist, a learned ruler, a woman who dared to challenge Rome at its height. Each generation reimagined her in its own image, sometimes villain, sometimes victim, always unforgettable. What's clear is that Cleopatra defied every expectation placed upon her. She ruled in a world dominated by men. She navigated the brutal politics of Rome and Egypt with unmatched skill. She spoke 9 languages, governed one of the richest nations of her time, and used her intellect and charisma as weapons just as sharp as any sword. In a world that rarely allowed women to hold real power, she not only held it, she wielded it on her own terms. Her legacy endured beyond tombs and monuments. Alexandria remained a center of knowledge and culture. Her story echoed in plays by Shakespeare, in paintings by Renaissance masters, and in the fantasies of filmmakers centuries later. Cleopatra became more than a historical figure, she became a symbol. A symbol of beauty, yes, but also of intelligence, defiance, leadership, and fate. She was the last queen of Egypt, but the first to capture the imagination of the world in such a profound way. Her life was a mosaic of victories and losses, love and war, wisdom and will. Even as time swept away the sand-covered ruins of ancient cities, her name lived on. Not as a conquered queen, but as a legend. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, and still Cleopatra's name lingered, like perfume in a room long after the flame has gone out. Her death may have ended Egypt's sovereignty, but her legacy defied the grave. While pyramids crumbled and palaces faded into dust, Cleopatra remained etched into the soul of history, not just as a queen, but as a force of nature. Ancient historians, many of them Roman men, tried to define her. They called her dangerous, manipulative, cunning. They reduced her to a temptress who used her beauty to corrupt great men. But even in their attempts to tarnish her, they could not look away. They could not stop writing about her. Because Cleopatra had done something truly rare. She had lived a life that demanded to be remembered. Her story wasn't just about seduction or power. It was about survival. It was about a woman, born into a brutal world of shifting loyalties, who played her hand with courage and brilliance. It was about a monarch who defied the expectations of her time, not by hiding her ambition, but by embracing it. She learned languages to speak directly to her people, when her ancestors hadn't even tried. She blended Greek knowledge with Egyptian traditions, ruling not just from a throne but from a library. She spoke to generals like an equal, navigated wars like a strategist, and shaped the future through diplomacy, spectacle, and sheer will. And though she ultimately lost to Rome, she never bowed to it. In the centuries that followed, her image transformed again and again. During the Renaissance, Cleopatra became the muse of artists and poets. Her face was imagined in marble and canvas, regal, serene, untouchable. In literature, she became the tragic heroine, the noble queen brought low not by weakness, but by her refusal to yield. Shakespeare gave her fire and depth. Painters gave her elegance and drama. Hollywood gave her spectacle and scandal. And modern historians began to dig beneath the myths, rediscovering the woman behind the legend. She was more than the lover of two Roman giants. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was a mother who fought to secure her child's future. She was a ruler who defended her kingdom until her final breath. She was a scholar who treasured knowledge and cultivated culture. She was, in many ways, the last echo of an ancient world that had begun with the pyramids and ended in the shadow of the Roman eagle. Cleopatra's tomb has never been found. Some say it lies beneath the ruins of Alexandria. Others believe it was hidden far from the city, buried beside Antony, just as she wished. And maybe that mystery is fitting. Because Cleopatra was never just one thing, never simply queen, or lover, or ruler. She was a story, a legend, a flame that refused to go out. And in that way, she remains eternal.